What I'm about to go over is obviously pure speculation, but I think I might be onto something, so I wanted to record a video that I can later point to and brag about having called it first. If I'm wrong, I'll quietly delete this video and deny it ever existed. Ever since the Elden Ring trailer dropped at E3, I've watched it a whole bunch of times, and there's a couple of things that have stood out to me. The first thing that immediately made me think, oh man, is this sci-fi? Was the line,
that which commanded the stars.
After having that initial spark, I went over the video again and again, and I think I have a nice working theory about what the setting of this game might be, and that is a post-advanced civilization that has regressed back to more primitive times. First, I'd like to present the evidence for this theory before summarizing the idea as a whole. We can start with the very first line of the trailer.
I doubt you could even imagine it.
Although vague, this line could potentially mean something like, because our civilization today is so primitive, you wouldn't even be able to comprehend the technological marvels that we achieved. It would be something akin to bringing a smartphone to a prehistoric man and trying to explain the properties of the device. It would seem impossible for the prehistoric man to even imagine it. Next we have,
that which commanded the stars.
again, this was what initially sparked this idea for the obvious reason that, if taken literally, any civilization that has command of the stars would have to be an advanced spacefaring civilization that has access to space travel. I would also like to point out how the gold streaming from this hammer seems to be following very defined lines. It's almost like what you'd see when you expose iron powder to a magnetic field. Now, I know that gold is not particularly magnetic, but we can't really be sure that it's pure gold that's streaming from the hammer, or that it's necessarily a magnetic field causing this effect. But whatever the reason, I think the effect shown in the trailer is too deliberate to be an accident. Next, I want to bring up the prosthetics.
The Elden Ring. Oh, Elden Ring.
Now, I know we've seen prosthetics before in From Software games with our boy from Sekiro, but I do want to point at some key differences between the two. The prosthetic in Sekiro has a very primitive look to it. It's all ropes, bone, and metal put together in an almost believable way for the setting it takes place in. It also only covers the forearm, which would require less articulation than an entire arm. On the other hand, the prosthetic we see on our Valkyrie shows no indication of any obvious primitive inner workings. We see the place it attaches is just a flat, smooth surface, with no real mechanical interface that would allow manipulation of the arm. This might indicate an advanced relic that would be inappropriate for a more fantastical setting. Now, one could argue that it's controlled by magic, and that's fair, but as Arthur C. Clarke's third law says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Next we have,
Look up at the sky. It burns.
here's where my theory starts to come together. If an advanced civilization regressed to a more primitive state, there must have been some event that caused this to happen. Enter the Elden Ring. Whatever the Elden Ring was, it seems to have been something that was greatly valued, gave life its fullest brilliance, and allowed them to command the stars. So let's talk about the word Eld. As some have pointed out, Eld can essentially be just another word for old, but there's another meaning. In Old Norse, the word Eld refers to fire. If we take the Elden Ring to be a fiery ring, this idea comes to mind. The Elden Ring was a type of Dyson sphere. If you're unfamiliar with Dyson spheres, they are essentially man-made structures that encircle a star in order to harvest its energy. If the Elden Ring was indeed a Dyson ring, its destruction might have cut off the inhabitants of this planet from their source of power, and, depending on how reliant they were on this source, it's possible that this caused their civilization to collapse and regress backwards technologically. The burning sky might just be the aftermath of the catastrophic event that caused the Elden Ring to malfunction. Perhaps it continues to malfunction, causing all sorts of problems for the inhabitants below. Lastly, I would like to talk about From Software and George R. R. Martin's previous works. If you remember the first Bloodborne teaser, you'll remember that it seemed like a straightforward Victorian horror setting, complete with zombies, zombie dogs, and beasts. There was zero indication in that trailer that the game would turn out to be a cosmic horror nightmare, so we know that From Software is no stranger to throwing a curveball at what might have been the initial expectations of their game. Similarly, George R. R. Martin has written several stories that take place in worlds that have regressed technologically. In fact, before Game of Thrones, most of his stories were actually science fiction. So it would not surprise me in the least if that's the setting he proposed for the game. Lastly, dark fantasy as a genre has already been explored by From Software in the Dark Souls and Demon Souls series. And seeing how Bloodborne and Sekiro tried so hard to differentiate themselves from that franchise, it would be strange for From to just go back to dark fantasy with their brand new series. At least I hope it's not just Dark Souls 4 under a different name. That pretty much sums up my Elden Ring is a sci-fi game theory. I know it's a bit of a long shot, but I really do think, or at least hope, that's the direction they take with the game. If you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments. Maybe you'll have some insight that backs up the sci-fi theory, or have a wild idea of your own. At this point, all we can do is wait for the game to be released, and then I'll know if I can brag and say, I called it.